Firelight Radio, don't touch the dial, 'cause here we go. You're just in time for the show at Firelight Radio. Welcome to Firelight Radio, where we tune into the nature folk movement. And it's good to have you by the campfire. And how rude of me not to introduce myself. My name is Guitar, and I know what you're thinking. That's odd to have a guitar hosting a podcast, but you can't have a nature folk movement without a guitar by the campfire. That's just obvious. Here at Firelight Radio, we're campfire inspired and guitar guaranteed. You're always going to hear a little crackling, and you're always going to hear a little strumming. And I think it's also obvious that you need more than a guitar and a campfire. You need someone else at the campfire. And today that is Bob from Before Phones. You know, Bob wears plenty of hats around here, many hats. And one is being the host of Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam. And in Before Phones, Bob gets down to the nitty-gritty of trying to figure out what the universe was like and how we actually coped, or actually how we survived before phones. I mean, what did people do before there were phones? It's a great mystery. And Bob tries to get to the bottom of that through a series of, well, they're not award-winning, but they might be award-winning yet. But let's just say possible future award-winning interviews. And in this case, he has a special guest. And so without further ado, let's go to the show. Where the dinosaurs roam. Welcome to Before Phones. It was a time we need to remind. We need to refine. Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam. Hey, this is Bob from Before Phones, and I wanted to interview myself. You know, sometimes you want to talk to somebody else, and other times you just want to interview yourself. And Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam, I'm a dinosaur. You know, I grew up before we had these phones that are ubiquitous. You know, I also grew up in the age when people used to smoke cigarettes in restaurants. And I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, but I remember when I lived in Cape Cod, I would go out on a Friday and, you know, we'd get something to eat and maybe drink a beer, and I would leave there and everything I was wearing would just smell like smoke, like an ashtray. And you kind of had to put that out separately, and you couldn't wear it the next day. But then I remember within years they just banned cigarettes, and people would be out in the bitter cold smoking a cigarette. This was before vaping. What did people do before vaping? You know, that was an ancient geologic time. Anyhow, I would go and, get some fish and chips at the local watering hole. I would go back home and my clothes just smelled fine. But today, the new cigarette is the cell phone, and it doesn't leave a stench on your clothes, or it doesn't usually leave a stench on your clothes. I think that nobody smells their phones, but I bet that they're sometimes dirty, because you have those, and not the phones, it's the cases you have them in. They're not as dirty as a keyboard, but they're up there on the list, especially for something we're using all the time. And then people work their phone and then handle food. And I think the two have to be, there's a great profits to be made for somebody who invented a sterilization spray for their phones. So anyhow, what's my point is, I'm trying to explore and get down to the bottom of what the pre-phone era was like, before phones. It was a time of great phonelessness. And when exactly was that time? I think the Apple phone, the iPhone came out in 2008, I think. And then, within 2 years, it was widely adopted, if not instantaneously, and it killed off a lot of competitors. But then, as always happens with Apple, they release something great, and Android or Microsoft or Google is right there with them. It reminds me of the old Russian spy days, where, we developed nuclear weapons, and then they developed nuclear weapons right away, too. And it was the same people on each side, and when word got out. That was the great thing about the pre-phone era. You could kind of keep things in wraps. You didn't have to Nobody knew what was going on. And that's what I loved about the pre-phone era. You had to read the newspaper, and sometimes you were reading newspapers that were 3 days old, and that was the latest news. Nowadays you have the constant, and I'm just complaining. That's not my point here to complain. I think, there's a necessary service to educate the new generation and remind the old generation, what it was like before phones. And I'm not saying everything we did before phones was great, but it was different. Cell phones are the new cigarettes. I mean, they're more widely adopted than the old cigarettes. You go to a restaurant nowadays and everybody's looking at their phones. Where not everybody before was smoking. And there was a smoking section. Why not have a cell phone section in a restaurant? Oh, you're looking at your cell phone, please, not in this area. You have to go into the cell phone area. And I think that would be really good because that would put a stigma on the cell phone users. And then they would hang out. But, unlike smoking cigarettes where they would go to the smoking area, people smoke a cigarette, they get some dopamine or serotonin or whatever swirling through their heads, and they get real social and they talk to the other people there. And I remember in the early years of working, people lamenting, I'm not a smoker, I don't get to take as many breaks at work. This was in the era where they couldn't smoke inside anymore, so they go to the outdoor staircase. And now they've probably made rules about that. And now the vaping. I know there's all these flavored vapes. Not that I've tried them, but you can sometimes smell them. I'll say to somebody, what's that smell? And they'll say, oh, it's a flavored vape. Or I went to visit my son, and we're in the elevator, and you can just smell where people, I guess, they hit the elevator, and it's a time for them to vape. It's like a baseball batter, sees the ball there, and they swing at it. I guess a vapor is in an elevator, and that, no matter what else they're doing, it's time to vape for them. But that's not my point. My point is that if we had a cell phone section in restaurants, people would go there, they wouldn't be social at all. It's the people without the phones that are the social people now. I think the phones have made us more social, but less social. We're constantly connected with people, but then when we're around them, we're distracted by our phones. Does that make sense? I think you text a person all day, hey, let's get together, we'll do something. Then you get together and you're both distracted by your phones because you're both texting someone else, hey, let's get together and do something. And it's a vicious cycle. I've seen it once, I've seen it 1,000 times. I don't think I've ever seen anything 1,000 times. That's a bad saying. We should kill that saying. It should be, if I've seen it once, I've seen it a more realistic number, like 24 times. Not 1,000. It's 1,000. Some things I've seen though, think if you see it 1,000 times, it's 3 years worth of driving by something to see it. And that's a lot, 3 years, but maybe not. What I really wanted to talk today about is, this, and welcome everyone to Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam. And again, my name's Bob, and I'm trying to explore what it was like, that time of great phonelessness, and to educate the masses, the new generation that's profoundly addicted to a phone, that makes a cigarette habit look like an innocent hobby, the degree that it's reshaping our brains. Cigarettes are bad for the lungs, and I think cell phones are bad for the posture, and they're bad for eyesight, and they're bad for the mind. Remember, when we didn't, you think you'd have a phone and you'd remember more numbers, but you don't remember a single number other than your childhood number that you grew up with. I still remember mine. And I remembered so many numbers, and you had them all by memory. You remember everybody's number by memory, and now I couldn't tell you a single number of a single friend, and that's so sad. I don't know, it's sad, but I think it does point out, recently I've been memorizing some things, and the mind has a great capacity to memorize. When you memorize something, it's its own reward. In my case, I'm memorizing some songs that I wrote, and I used to sing them just one time at a farewell. When somebody would leave, the swamp, and I'd write them a farewell song, I'd sing it once, and that was the end of that song. They only left once. We had one ranger who kept coming back because I didn't get him a song right away, and he kept visiting. He kept returning, and then finally, after the 5th time he returned, I'm like, John, I got a song for you. And he was so happy. He didn't expect it. Or maybe he did, because he never returned after that. And the song was about the ranger kept returning until he got his song. And it was very prescient. Prescient. Yeah, that's another term. One of the nice things about a phone is you'll read something and you can immediately look up the definition. And I like using a good word like prescient. That might be the word that I use for the day. And I didn't glean that word from the phone. It just kind of popped in my head. It's very prescient. I foreshadowed that, or not clairvoyant. Prescient it's kind of like a timely form of clairvoyance. When you're clairvoyant, you predict something that happens in the future. It's going to be a time of great phonefulness. If I would have said that, when the iPhone first came out, I predict a time of great phonefulness, and people are just tethered to their phones, and I would have been clairvoyant. But it would be more prescient for me to say something like, to have written that song, and it prophesized what came true, and he has never returned since then. Because he was satisfied with one song. It was a very good song, and I don't blame him. I mean, how do you... Really, it's my fault. How do you return after a song like that? Maybe I scared him away. It was the return of the Lone Ranger. So what am I saying here? I think phones have kind of made us dumber. I think we think of ourselves as, we all want to be experts. I saw this app where you could take a picture. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a botanist by any stretch of the imagination. I know a tree when I see one. At any moment, I'm looking at a tree. You look out the window, there's a tree. And there's all sorts. Now that I'm looking at trees, I'm seeing all these different types of trees, and it's pretty impressive, but I'm no botanist. I can identify those as a tree. I know they're not a bear, for example. And that's clearly a tree. And it's not a grass. No, it's a tree. That would be one big giant grass if it grew that big. And you'd think, why didn't they mow there? No, that's a tree. Trees just grow bigger. And I know a tree when I see one, but I saw an app that you can take a picture of any tree and your phone will tell you by the bark what type of tree it is. So you can become a tree expert. And I guess that's good. It's a gateway to quickly becoming an expert. I mean, in the old school, if you wanted to be a botanist, you had to go to school and you had to take classes and you had to go out in the field. Well, now you kind of have the teacher with you, your phone. I feel sorry for the botanists out there because they can no longer teach better than the phone. You go and ask a botanist a question, I'm thinking, why am I bothering? I have that app, and the app's going to be much more informative. And then I ask a botanist, and they add things that the phone doesn't tell you, And they don't have ads, unless they're wearing a T-shirt that, might be, people wear T-shirts sometimes now, and they might promote a cause, or, even if it's like a Nike T-shirt, they're kind of promoting Nike. But on the app, it's telling me all these things. If I recently looked up banjos, I'm on the tree app, and they're telling me I need to buy a banjo. You don't go to an old professor and, the whole time the professor's talking, that he's talking about the different tree species and then going through all the botanical stuff and then saying, hey, everybody, you should buy a banjo, or you need a harmonica, or, it's like, what? So how do you become an expert anymore? I don't think we've outsourced the expertise to our phones. If you want to quickly ramp up on trees, I might do an app where you take a picture of something and it'll tell you tree or not tree. And for example, you take a picture of it, it'll tell you it's a rock. You're looking at a rock, and you take a picture of a bridge and it'll tell you it's a bridge. That'll be my app. And then it'll tell you the history of bridges. Like, what was the first bridge built by the Huns or by the Romans? The Romans probably built really good bridges. And bridges were the original internet when you think about it. It's what connected us. I mean, have you ever read those old accounts of the towns that lived on opposite sides of rivers? They were almost separate entities, and the guy who ran the ferry was so pivotal in that community, and he connected people, but it was kind of like they lived in the hinterlands, and you'd go across, and it could be dangerous, and it was almost like a lock keeper. They lived separately. And then they built the bridges, and those two sides became kind of seamless parts of one another and greased the wheels on commerce. But the bridge connected everyone in a way. I mean, roads did the same thing, but bridges were the last obstacle, these rivers and gorges that prevented things from being connected. So, yeah, it's fascinating to read those old accounts. And maybe that's what my app would do. You know, you take a picture of a bridge and it would tell you what happened before the bridge was there. It would kind of be a deep history. That's a bad app. Nobody would buy it. And it probably wouldn't work. Probably be glitchy. And it would probably tell people to buy a lot of banjos. Probably, you know, maybe it would get a lot of ad revenue from the banjo community. Maybe it would turn to a resurgence of people playing the banjo. I mean, it's a fine instrument. The banjo, harmonica, harpsichord, they kind of never quite caught on. I mean, the guitar, the guitar, the piano, and accordion. The accordion. I don't know, the accordion, there is no equivalent for it, but you know. So there you have it. I think we discussed a great deal. And, you know, it's the art of conversation, I think really is what it is. And there's all these apps on my phone. I rarely use any of them. I find I kind of default to my phone as a bad habit often. And on the feed, I have one newspaper that I can get on my phone. And I used to love getting the newspaper and actually the spread of the newspaper. And what I loved about the newspaper, it was a known volume. I would just read it and that was my news for the day. And you could get a deeper read, you really could, and then you were done with the news feed. You know, I remember growing up, there was the morning and the evening sun, and that's what's happened with the news feed. You read the news in the morning, and then you read it in the evening. But in actuality, you're reading it all the time. And I turned off notifications. I don't want to be notified about anything anymore. So I think, you know, what am I talking about? You know, before phones, where the dinosaurs roam, I'm a dinosaur. And I'm just trying to figure out, like back in the smoking era, how many cigarettes should I smoke per day? And where do I smoke them? You know, and wow, this is addictive. The Surgeon General is I'm trying to be the Surgeon General and saying, hey, here's the new bargain, the grand plan for your phone, that you have to know how to use the phone. You know, it's a great device and very powerful. And it's a misnomer how it's been named, that we even call it a phone. It's a computer. We're walking around with a computer. It's not even a phone. By definition, phone uses analog, but the computer is actually simulating the function of a phone. Let's face it, nobody even leaves a voicemail message anymore, and if they do, people don't listen to them. They read them because it's translated. So, you know, just trying to find before phones, where the dinosaurs roam. I think it's two things here. We're trying to educate the masses on what we did before phones. You know, what was it like, this great geologic era when you dig just an inch below the surface, there's no phones down there. For as many phones as you see, you'd think there would be a vast geologic landscape of just formed by phones, like marine limestone at the bottom of the sea floor. But no, there are none. So what I'm trying to do here with Before Phones, or what we're trying to do with Before Phones, is to understand that time of great phonelessness. Remind the dinosaurs out there what it was like, but also remind the new generation, or inform the new generation what it was like. But I think the flip side of the corollary, and I love using the word corollary because it sounds very sophisticated, is that we're trying to figure out ourselves what are best practices for using a phone, you know, in the modern era, and things to think about. How to get a better balance of utilizing the phone or not utilizing the phone, or coming up with new apps. Like my new app, about an app that could tell you it's a rock or a tree. That would be valuable. We're looking at, what is that thing? Oh yeah, it's a rock. That's right. Oh yeah, and that's a tree. That would be a valuable app. And then you end up with a banjo. And you'd probably buy a banjo because you'd probably click on the ad. And that would be a good contribution. So there you have it. Thank you so much for tuning in to Before Phones, Where the Dinosaurs Roam. My name's Bob, and usually I have an interview, but sometimes I just have some thoughts on my mind that clearly need to be discussed with, you know, that I have to think through before I have a person on the interview. I think that's one thing you don't understand about interviews. You have to prep for an interview. You know, it's many, many hours of prepping before you actually interview someone. And then you interview them. You ever notice that sometimes you interview someone and you're like, what do we talk about? and your questions are really bad. You probably don't want questions in an interview. You just want to extemporaneously, talk about different topics. It's the art of conversation. The conversation with yourself and then a conversation with others. They're kind of two different things. So, thanks so much for tuning in to Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam, and we'll talk to you next time. In the meantime, just hang around a little bit. We might have some parting gifts, and we'll talk to you soon. Welcome to Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam. Welcome to Before Phones. It was a time we need to remind, we need to refine. Before Phones, where the dinosaurs roam. Well, there you have it. And thank you, Bob, and thank you, Before Phones. That was kind of intriguing, It does make you think about the before phone era, how things were different. Just before phones where the dinosaurs roam, the cell phone kind of caused a lot of things to go extinct. And I'm not talking, the species that might be going extinct, as we're saying we're in the sixth great extinction. It's happening very slowly. But they're discovering new species too. And I always hold out hope that, I'm going to wake up and things are just going to all start getting better. Think of how many things the cell phone made extinct. Like the answering machine on a phone. That made it extinct. The chest, I remember when I was a kid, I had a chess game that I've had in a little leather pouch, and I could play it digitally. You do that on your phone now, I guess, and the list goes on. They're two examples. There's other things that made extinct. Other things maybe you use less often, like a pencil. Nobody's using a pencil or an eraser as much, and they're bad examples, but you get what I'm saying. So thanks so much for tuning in to Firelight Radio, where we tune in to the nature folk movement. Here at Firelight Radio, we're campfire inspired and guitar guaranteed. You're always going to hear a little crackle, and you're always going to hear that strumming. So I'm just going to do a little bit of strumming right now to round out the podcast. And feel free to hang around. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next time. And in the meanwhile, trying to think of a new catchphrase. Shoot for the stars. Don't be afraid to land on a meteor. No, a meteor will actually be taking you backwards. So you want to land on a comet. Comet will take you for a ride. You want to have proper equipment with you if you're going to go for a ride. It's kind of like extreme hiking. You go hiking, you want to have a sleeping bag, food for a couple days. If you're going on a comet, you're going to need a lot of gear. So before you shoot for the stars, think about all that. And we'll talk to you soon.